Hi, my name is Church Key. I'm a retired United States Air Force General Officer who serves as the Executive Director of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center at the University of Alaska. We are hosted by the Department of Homeland Security. We're one of 9 active centers of research that are sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security. We're focused on the geographic region of the Arctic and functionally aligned to the United States Coast Guard. Our mission as a center is to advance Arctic domain awareness. The presentation I have the privilege to present at this wonderful gathering at the Geostrategic Futures symposium is really focused on the changing Arctic and the understanding that a changing Arctic has implications to a changing Antarctic. The aspect of the Arctic region today, of course, is being driven principally because of a warming Arctic, warming at twice the rate of lower latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. In this context, the Arctic is actually providing a much more dynamic environment, physically speaking, because of changing weather patterns. You're essentially seeing diminishing sea ice, and you're seeing increasing weather patterns that were historically more aligned to the lower latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere, making itself manifest in the Arctic region. So you're seeing a lack of weather stability, increasing difficulty in forecasting, increasing effects, of course, of a diminishing ice environment, and reducing frozen nature of the Arctic in the context of less sea ice, thawing permafrost, increasing wind, waves, and fetch from essentially the lessening of a dampening influence of Arctic sea ice. The Arctic, of course, is a region that is a maritime region surrounded by territories, and is what's historically known as the cul-de-sac of the world's oceans. Historically, the Arctic is an area where sea ice has been a dampener and a stabilizer of weather. Try and understand the Arctic in fine scale, because at the end of the day, while there's a lot of research that's trying to understand the large climate, global perspectives of changing Arctic and the impacts to there, and there's not enough research that's actually underway in understanding the Arctic at fine scale. So when you look at the fact that today there's roughly 4 million residents across the circumpolar Arctic, and roughly half of those, of course, live in Russia, and the rest remain the other portions, being the Nordic and North American Arctic regions. Those are citizens who live in an Arctic region that's increasingly difficult to understand what's happening. So trying to advance domain awareness is accounting for imagery, measurements, weather patterns, measurements and characterization of sea ice, modeling, and trying to assess the variables of essentially from the seabed to the surface in the water column, and then from the surface in that same column review to the stratosphere. Oriented also, of course, to specific given regions. What's changing, for example, in the Bering Straits, if you one of the 2 principal entrance points into the Arctic basin from a maritime vantage point. Today, of course, the Arctic has great exploration activities because they're in a diminishing ice environment. The access barriers are much lower. And so mineral resources, hydrocarbons, and more are more easily accessible, and certainly at a lower threshold cost. Of course, in addition to the quest for extracting the mineral wealth of the Arctic, a diminishing ice environment also, of course, enables an opportunity for Great Circle navigation in maritime shipping. Today there's the Northwest Passage, of course, through Canadian waters, and then the Northern Sea Route, historically known as the Northeast Passage, that goes along Russia's north coast. Russia today, of course, is monetizing the Northern Sea Route to a degree, essentially providing escort services to those vessels that are plying through those waters. Today, of course, the transpolar route, which would be the ultimate, if you will, Great Circle navigation route between markets in East Asia to Europe, it's difficult to go through today because there's still quite a bit of sea ice there. On the other hand, if you look to just in the coming decades, not that far to the future, you'll see that at least seasonally will likely have a diminished ice environment to such that hardened vessels can get through, maybe without escort even. But looking at this aspect from the standpoint of draft. Today, when you look at domain awareness challenges in the Northern Sea Route versus the Northwest Passage versus transpolar, the Northwest Passage is somewhere in the neighborhood of 33-foot draft. The Northern Sea Route somewhere on 38-foot draft. If you're more than that draft, you can't really get through there safely. Unlimited draft, of course, going through the transpolar route. So not only, of course, mineral extraction, but also shipping provides incentive for people coming north and leveraging a diminishing ice environment. We're also looking, of course, that tourism and fishing are also things that are obviously there's a moratorium that the Arctic Council, signatory nations, and observers have signed on to prevent harvesting fish stocks in the Central Arctic Ocean. On the other hand, if you look at where fish stocks are today, in the case of what historically was a fisheries management problem between Great Britain and Norway, is now a fisheries management problem between Norway and Russia, as fish stocks have moved through from the North Sea, the Norwegian Sea, and into the Barents. Today, on the other side of the Arctic, historically there has been a coal pool that's kept fish stocks located in the southern Bering, and as a result of recent changes in the physical sea ice regime of the region of the Bering, the Chukchi, that area has changed quite substantially. And what we historically was served as a stopper that kept fish stocks bottled up and not moving north into the Chukchi from the Bering Straits was actually now greatly diminished. So fish stocks are now following suit in the Western Arctic as they have on the Eastern Arctic, moving from the Bering into the Chukchi. Fish stocks, therefore, is going to be incentive for folks that are nations that are seeking fish proteins to continue to press the test and going further north. So fish stocks, tourism, minerals, hydrocarbons, and of course transpolar great circle route shipping are all incentive for activities to continue to increase. So how do you characterize today domain awareness? Domain awareness is really understanding what's happening in the physical aspects of the Arctic environment, and then also coupling with that the changing conditions of the human terrain. And from our vantage point, there's an economic incentives that are happening, and again, the threshold of access to leverage those economic opportunities has been greatly reduced. We still mindful, though, that advancing Arctic domain awareness should principally help support our respective national interests between Arctic nations, and certainly between the case of the North American Arctic, between Canada and the United States. It's our mutual interest to sort out what's happening in the changing environment and also sort out what's happening in the conditions of the changing human terrain. And one of the principal reasons for this, of course, is that those things that help us as nations better protect our own citizens and our respective national interests. Today, in the Arctic region of the United States, we have roughly 166,000 U.S. citizens who live in an Arctic context. And if you take a look today, many of those people who live in America's Arctic, the United States Arctic region, draw their subsistence-based lifestyles from the sea. So as nations and national interests look towards extracting and exploiting a diminishing ice Arctic environment, we've got to be mindful that doing so in a sustainable, safe manner is critical. It's critical because of being great environmental stewards of a pristine region, and also the implications of poor stewardship may have on people who draw their livelihood from the sea, to include their own individual and family caloric intake. So it's important for all of us who are concerned about advancing Arctic domain awareness, think about the multiple variables in play. In an Arctic that is changing quite dramatically as a result of a set of warming conditions that is resulting in a diminished ice environment, the fact that that threshold barrier is much lower, and therefore the opportunity for nations and non-state actors to take advantage of this in a way that hopefully will be done in a sustainable, manageable way. But we need to be ready as nations to, through advancing Arctic domain awareness, have the fidelity of understanding to know when we need to take action to do things that protect the environment and protect our citizens and, of course, their respective national interests. So I hope that's a good starting point. We'll see where it goes from there. 3 key strategic considerations for the Arctic region. Number 1, a diminishing ice environment increases the opportunity for state actors and non-state actors to conduct activities. In this context, are they doing so safely? Are great powers acting responsibly in the Arctic? Are they exploiting the Arctic for a strategic national advantage to their own respective national interest? That's number 1. Number 2, are resources being developed in a responsible, sustainable way? We cannot afford, as a community of people who care deeply about the Arctic region, to have disasters as a result from exploration and development activities that causes, for example, a large or substantial maritime oil spill. Also, of course, the fact that mineral wealth and the fact that marine mammals and fisheries can be greatly affected by improper development of mineral resources as far as extraction. And of course, also strategically thinking about maritime shipping. Can it be done safely in an area that is still not easy to navigate? So again, great power activities, doing so in a responsible way, in resource development and extraction, and then lastly, maritime shipping. Is it being done in a safe, responsible manner? Because the last thing we need to have is, again, an oil tanker that has just conducted itself poorly, hits sea ice, the next thing you know, you've got a shipborne or Arctic maritime oil spill. So those are the three that I would categorize, and hopefully that helps. Well, there's obviously, when you look at research that's been conducted in the Arctic, it's trying to help understand that this region that is this maritime basin that is surrounded by nations and populated by indigenous people in the North American context, Asiatic, but then really of various ancestry across the Eurasian landmass. But indigenous people who claim the Arctic home, who have a PhD in Arctic living, understanding their perspectives as, again, we try to understand the changing physical environment, and doing so at an increasingly fine scale in an area that is data poor, some cases data deprived. Understanding that what's changing in the Arctic requires the ability to measure where it's been and comparing it to where it's at. When you look to the southern polar regions, there obviously, from a physical standpoint, it's quite exactly the opposite. A large landmass surrounded by an open polar sea. However, the same warming conditions in the Arctic that's resulting in a diminishing sea ice environment, to include, of course, sea ice melt in the Greenlandic ice sheet, has the same effects, impact potentials as you look to the Antarctic landmass and the sea ice that surrounds the landmass, at least on a fairly substantial seasonal basis. So essentially, warming conditions and changing the water column from the seabed to the surface, as you look to understand that within an Arctic context, the same problems that exist in the polar seas surrounding the Antarctic landmass. Can you understand what's happening in that water column? And again, at the surface level, and then going skyward towards the stratosphere. Do you understand what's happening in that from all the environmental factors? Taking a look at ocean acidification in the Arctic region, taking a look at ocean acidification in the Antarctic region, taking a look at the effects of a changing pH and salinity content in and around the Arctic versus the Antarctic, and the effects it has, of course, to marine wildlife. So there is much to learn from studying one region and learning what you can and applying it to the other. In the same context, that there's much happening in the Antarctic that we should be able to learn and apply in the Arctic context. Since the treaty in 1959, the Antarctic region has been a zone of peace that's been principally devoted to the exploration of science. What scientific conclusions has been discovered in the Antarctic context that can be applied to an Arctic context? Do we really know enough? Has there been enough correlation of that scientific discovery from both poles?